Should Noach have done more to try and help the people of his generation? Could he have done more? That's the question. We well know that the Chazal are some critical, some not so critical of Noach. That he did not daven on behalf of his generation, as the Zohar tells us. He didn't ask the Eibishter's mercy for the world. And the comparison is that he's not like Moshe Rabbeinu, who even davened to save those people who were involved in the terrible avera of making the Egel Azov. The Zohar brings a debate between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Huda says, listen, the fact that Noach did not daven for his people like Moshe davened for the Oisei HaEgel, it's not a lack on Noach's behalf. Just because you have to remember that Moshe Rabbeinu did not daven with his own merits. He depended on Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. He depended on the merits of the forefathers. And obviously Noach didn't have that option. There was nobody who preceded him that he could say, do it in their merit. So that's according to Rabbi Huda, therefore don't be critical of Noach. Whereas Rabbi Yitzchak holds, he says, no, Noach didn't have schus, that's true, but he still should have davened, and he still should have tried to arouse mercy on their behalf. So the Rebbe's father explains why Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak hold each of their opinions. It has to do with who they are. How come it is that Rabbi Yehuda is looking for ways to find merit for Noach, and Rabbi Yitzchak is finding criticism? The Rebbe's father explains because Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak are coming from their respective spiritual realities. Rabbi Yehuda is a person who imbues chesed. Therefore, he follows his trait, which is kindness, and he looks to be kind to Noach and find a merit for Noach. Whereas Rabbi Yitzchak is all about gvura, which includes being discerning and even critical, and therefore following his trait, he looks to be critical of Noach. Why did you not daven more for your people? But even then, there's a very big question that we have to deal with over here, which is, under what circumstances are you allowed to be publicly critical of another person, especially when they're not there to defend themselves? Because the instruction that the Torah gives us in Pirkei Avos, which is that you always have to judge people favorably, is, as the Mishnah seems to imply, obviously, to everybody, every single person. Even if you are predisposed to Gvura, you are still required to be done l'kaf schus. So on what basis does Rabbi Yitzchak feel justified to be able to look for reason to be critical of Noach? Why doesn't he follow the instruction of the Mishnah and give him the benefit of the doubt, judge him favorably? Okay, so that's one debate, and there's an even more well-known debate. Similar to this debate, but definitely more well known, it's brought both in the Gemara and in the Medrash. There's the very famous debate about the first pasuk in our parasha, which says Noach ish tzaddik gomer, that Noach was a tzaddik and a tamim, somebody who's a sincere or perfect individual, b'doyrosav in his generation. So yes, Rabbi said, even Rashi brings it. Yes, Rabbi said, some people see this as they extrapolate out of this that this is praising Noach, that kol sheken shiloh tzaddikim tzaddik yosef, that if he could be a tzaddik even in such a malevolent generation, how much more so would he be a tzaddik if he was surrounded by tzaddikim? And some people use it as a criticism of Noach. That actually he was only a tzaddik relative to his generation, whereas but if he was in Avram Avinu's generation, he would not have even been on the scale of righteous individuals. So here too, this debate raises the same question we had with the first debate. Seeing as we have a choice, are we going to look to interpret or extrapolate out of this pasuk something which is praiseworthy or something which is critical? Why do we choose, at least that opinion that says that it's ignai, that it's the disgrace of Noach? Why do you choose to go down that route? Rather be done kaf schus. And what makes this even more acute is when you consider we learn, and the Gemara learns it from this week's parasha, that the Torah won't even speak in a denigrating way about a non-pure animal. The Torah won't use a disparaging term, even with regards to an animal, and even an animal that isn't kosher. So certainly the Torah is not going to speak negatively about Noach. If that's the case, how could there be an opinion that says, you know why the Torah added the word b'doraisov? Only to highlight something negative about Noach? That's not the Torah's way. So how do you get into that headspace that you think that b'doraisov means that something is negative about Noach? So in order to understand this, the Rabbi references a previous Sikha in Chelek Hey, that we know the fact that the Torah does not use inappropriate or less than complementary language, in the context when the Torah is telling us stories or describing people or situations. Whereas if the Torah is teaching us something pragmatic, halacha, how to behave, then the Torah is going to use clear language, as the Gemara in Pesachim also says. Even if, in order to be clear, I have to use language that is not euphemistic. The reason is because when you're telling halach, you have to be absolutely clear what you're saying. So that you have a clear instruction. And the reason you have to be so clear is that nobody should mistake how they're supposed to behave in practice. So the same applies over here. You might think that this is just a story or a description about Noach. It's an instruction. The fact that the Torah adds the word Noach is a tzaddik in his generation, which leaves the possibility of an opinion that says that this is negative, because had the Torah not highlighted this, we, the readers, might have misunderstood how to conduct ourselves based on the story in the Torah. There's a halacha that would apply to real life that we might get wrong. Because when you examine Noach's conduct, there's certain things that give the impression that maybe Noach is not a perfect tzaddik. If the Torah had described these things about Noach's tzidkus, about his righteousness, that are less than perfect, and not contextualized to say, well, it's relative to his generation, we could misinterpret and say, well, you could behave that way and you could still be a perfect tzaddik. Therefore, the Torah has no option but to highlight what within Noach's conduct is not as good as it should be. So we'd have clear instruction how we should behave. In fact, we could take it a step further. The fact that there are opinions who derive out of the Torah's description something negative about Noach, they're not saying that Noach actually was deficient. It's a drash, meaning to say they are mining the description of Noach and learning from it a behavior that would be a deficient behavior, not that Noach was deficient. The way the Torah describes Noach, whose circumstances only allowed a certain behavior, is that we should darshan from that if we were to behave the same way, that would be deficient. And that will ensure that we don't land up behaving in an inappropriate way because of what we've learned about Noach. Dear Shlomo, because we would say as follows. The fact that there are some who darshan the pasuk to say this is a praise of Noach, and some who darshan, who expound the pasuk to say that it's a disgrace of Noach. They're not arguing about what kind of a tzaddik or how great a tzaddik Noach was. They're giving two perspectives that are not in contrast to each other. They're not debating whether Noach would be a tzaddik or not in Avraham Avinu's generation. Everybody agrees, even those that Dosham Moisei Gnai, they all agree that you can't expect Noach to be the tzaddik of the caliber of Avraham Avinu, because he is in a generation and he is relative to his generation, and because they're such a lowly generation, he cannot be such a great tzaddik. Had he been placed in a different context, he would have been a super tzaddik. They're not debating that. Nobody here sees Noach as anything less. So what are they debating? Who the disagreement is, when the Torah describes Noach, who's an incredible tzaddik in his times, and couldn't be expected to do anything better, then you have to ask yourself, so why does the Torah add the word b'doraisov? There has to be a lesson. There's a debate as to what the lesson is. So one opinion is very simple. The Torah is telling us, look at his generation, and still he's a tzaddik. This is a great accolade for Noach. Whereas the other opinion says, that it's saying that the conduct of Noach was acceptable in the context of his generation, so we don't learn and imagine that it's acceptable in the context of our generation. That's the opinion that darshans, that discusses the perspective that could be negative. If I'm looking at Noach, the person and the life that he lived, no deficiency. Because he's living in such a terrible generation, there is no expectation that he will reach the caliber of Avram Avinu. Now, if that's the degree of tzaddik that Noach could be at that time, then the Torah has to say, but that's not the aspiration. You shouldn't want to be a tzaddik like Noach was. Noach's circumstances were such that that's all he could be. Because if I'm comparing Noach, who we're excusing, we're accepting his behavior, had he been in a different situation in Avram Avinu's generation, that wouldn't be good enough. So we could have a clear lesson what we're supposed to learn from Noach. So what are we supposed to learn from Noach? Let's go back to the first debate we raised. Let's go back to the debate between Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it was appropriate for Noach not to daven for his generation because he didn't have the resources to do it, as opposed to Rabbi Yitzchak, who said he should have still tried. In the same way as we explained in the previous debate, they're not arguing about the facts, they're arguing about the lesson. Even Rabbi Yitzchak, who is critical of Noach, acknowledges that Noach did not have the resources that Avram Avinu had, or certainly that Moshe Rabbeinu had, to be able to daven, and if he wasn't expected to daven more. He did not have schus avos like Moshe had. It's not his fault, it's not his deficiency. So why then is Rabbi Yitzchak making a fuss that he should have davened? Rabbi Yitzchak wants to ensure that there is no mistake that future generations make after reading the story of Noach. We have a responsibility as the custodians of Torah to clarify that kind of behavior, where you don't daven for your generation, is not acceptable behavior. Even though Noach didn't have an alternative. But the behavior, as a behavior, should not be an acceptable behavior. The lesson we have to have is that every person has to try everything in their ability to daven for a fellow person, for a fellow Yid, that the Eibishter should give them rachamim. So Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion, where he's critical that Noach apparently should have davened more, he's not judging him unfavorably. Because Rabbi Yitzchak agrees that Noach not davening for his generation is not something he is accountable for. Or Rabbi Yitzchak wants us to know is, when we read the story, we dare not use Noach's situation as an excuse for us not davening for somebody else. But to the contrary, who he built a Ritzuya. If we don't do this, Rabbi Yitzchak says, if we don't highlight that not davening for other people is not a good thing, that will actually be negative for Noach. Because if Noach would be the cause of me not davening for the next person, then Noach would be guilty for my not davening for the next person. So Rabbi Yitzchak is in a sense protecting Noach by saying Noach's situation is unique, but that kind of an approach should never be considered hoirah. It should never be Torah. It should never be what we apply in our lives. So therefore, telling us that Noach should have davened for the people is actually to his merit. That's what Noach wants us to know, wants us to learn. That it should be emphasized that a person has to daven for his generation. And it's such a big deal that we almost indicate as if it is a lack on Noach's behalf that he didn't do it. Which is what you would see if you read Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion at face value. That despite the fact that Noach did not have those resources that Moshe Rabbeinu had, he still should have tried. To make it absolutely clear to us that none of us should ever lack the capacity or the interest or the drive to daven for those who need help. Once Rabbi Yitzchak alerts us to the fact that Noach's behavior is fundamentally a lacking behavior. By doing so, Rabbi Yitzchak gets all of us to be motivated to behave differently and to be able to daven on behalf of those who need our davening. That is a tikkun. It helps to rectify what Noach practically, for reasons beyond his control, didn't and couldn't do. Even though there was no way that Noach could have davened for his people, but at the end of the day, thanks to Noach and the lesson learned from him, by Rabbi Yitzchak highlighting that what Noach did is Noach's story, but it's not the correct way to behave. From there comes the lesson for all of us across the whole of history that we have to daven for other people. That fills in the gap. Noach couldn't daven for his people because it wasn't possible. Now that we're davening for the people of our generation in Noach's merit or due to Noach's inspiration, that becomes part of the fulfillment of him davening for others in distress. That has a very practical lesson for us now. Even when a person has invested all of the effort that they possibly imagine they can in order to have a positive impact on the people around them, the people of their generation. There are times where, due to circumstances outside of our control, we're not so successful in having that effect. And then the person could say, look, I come to the conclusion that I did what I had to do. I've saved myself. Nobody can accuse me of not trying. Not only have I progressed in my own spiritual service, but I've done whatever I had to do in outreach to other people. I did the best that I could. And it wasn't successful, but not because of lack of trying. It's not my problem. It's not my lack. It's not my deficiency. Therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak teaches us it's actually possible, like in Noach's case, that you really, really did everything that you possibly could. It's not an imaginary thing. You followed the Shulchan Aruch. You did everything that halacha required of you. But you still have to know that you can't be satisfied with that, even though you did the very, very best that you could. It's not acceptable to be satisfied with a situation where somebody else is still in sorrows. You have to daven and daven and daven without stopping, that the person should be affected, inspired, influenced. Because if we don't daven, appeal to the Eibishter to look out for the members of our generation, then we're the ones who are lacking. So when a person is davening that there should be a solution to those things that they cannot change for the better, that becomes part of their merit. And as a result of that, then the Eibishter, as only the Eibishter can, will remove the obstacles and obstructions to things being the way that they should. And allows the person the ability to be able to daven for the people of his generation until they actually do come around and do tshuva. Especially nowadays. We're in a time in history where the Rambam paskins lahalocha in his book of halachas that that it's an absolute guarantee that the Eibishter promised through his Torah that Yidden will do tshuva at the end of the galus, and we will be immediately redeemed.